As I said, it's 1 hour of the presentation and then half an hour for discussion.
Yes, thank you. Just practical thing first. I can share my screen, right?
Yeah, I will share you to. I will allow you to do that. Oh. Now it should be okay.
Okay, very good. So yes, thank you for the invitation. Just a short word in the beginning. It's quite a long time that I'm now working on cartography, but not in the sense of geographical cartography, but from a point of view of history, territorial history, ethnohistory, which includes the question, how are societies organizing their territories? Which sources do we have to understand the development of territories? And territories does not mean just territories from a political administrative point of view, but from a point of view of settlements, routes, ancient routes, modern routes, points of meeting, of interconnections, and of course of boundaries. And boundaries, and this I have to make clear here, is nothing modern. Boundaries are what we find always when you have societies linked with territories and who define their territories, who define the use of their territories. So from a point of view of social anthropology, from the point of view of the history of peoples, history of populations, in short, ethnohistory, the study of especially historical maps is of great importance. We can make a full talk on even archaeology in 19th century maps. I don't do this now. Now I have chosen the question, what do these maps tell us about perspectives of politics, or how are they used in political contexts, and how maybe they are misused, and how they can be used for understanding territorial concepts of populations, of states, and of local peoples simply. Yeah, so I will start with the PowerPoint presentation itself. I think it should be shared now.
Yes, it is.
If it works. Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, so the topic is, the main topic is in the main title, local political traditions in the context of Ethiopian cartography. With Ethiopian cartography, I mean something very general, not necessarily maps produced by Ethiopians and in Ethiopia, even if this is an important part of this presentation, but cartography of the Ethiopian region, including its neighboring states and its neighboring territories and historical territories of the region. And local political traditions is important for me because, as I said, from an anthropological point of view, it's important to understand what is the relationship between societies and territory. And societies start on the village level, and that's why I chose this picture for the opening. Villages themselves have their own territory. They have their relation with their territory. It includes land rights, definition of land rights, who gets which land to plow and who decides it. How is the society creating balance and legal peace in the sense that people accept that something is a law. If people do not agree that a specific law exists, but other people insist that this law exists, there will always be contradiction and clash. So what we see in the relationship between villages and their land is already a legal relationship, a social political relationship, even with small territories in comparison to big states. So if we look at the territorial concepts of population, we would not be in the right track if we start with the perspective of the state. The state has his or her, as you want, own way of approaching territory from a state perspective, which is very much linked with realities and fantasies of constitutionalism, I include the word fantasies because very often states define a territory in a way which contradicts some of the local and regional realities. And realities mean simply which socio-political practices are found on the ground. So this is the focus today. And my focus is especially on this interaction and contradiction between these local political traditions and the wider perspective of the state. And that's why I have this subtitle, The Use of Maps in Historical Policymaking in the 19th and 20th centuries. The policymaking from the side of the Ethiopian state is mainly starting from the 20th century. However, policymaking in the wider context by actors in the region has started well before in the context of international colonialism, imperialism, interventionism, and things like that, where it's also very important to define and redefine territories in order to define where one has to act and which territories belong to which spheres of interest. So in this sense, I define the state as one of many actors, not the only actor, but one of many actors defining the claim on territories in competition with other actors also defining the territory. And I start here with an image, which is a painting on the wall of a school, with an image representing the federal state of Ethiopia. Since the early 1990s, Ethiopia has redefined itself in reaction to local realities. That's what I want to underline. In reaction to local realities, in reaction to local traditions of autonomy, of resistance, of great differences of ecological and economical land use. In reaction to it, it has defined itself as a federal state with regional states, so-called kililoj. So these regional states are what we see here. And these regional states have been defined in relation with ethnic identities. I will explain what I mean with this a bit surprising formula, and in relation with regional settings and inter-regional settings, to put it like that. So that's an important point now. States, if we look at territorial history of states, are usually trying to define a wider region very much according to a, let's say, constitutional fantasy, a constitutional image of how the state should be. The word should be is very important because states very often see themselves as sort of pioneers of legal progress, of pioneers even of territorial progress, which easily, if these fantasies go too far and create a cleavage between local practices and claims and the fantasies of the state, this necessarily always, historically you can see it anywhere, creates never-ending conflicts and very often culminating even in armed conflicts. The definition of land works only in relation with the diverse societies who have a share on the land and a share on the fantasy of what a land should be. That's very important. So even if in modern political history, we have this focus on states, even if in modern political talking and including political science, we have this focus on the so-called monopoly of violence of states, these concepts are quite misleading. They are theoretically weak and ahistorical. So if you want, I would even say political history is ahistorical because it starts from an ideological starting point very often. It's becoming better, I would say, but very often from an ideological point of view, from an ideological 19th century based system of thought, which believes that states are the main historical actors. This is, of course, ingrained in the international system, so it is absolutely true if we take it as part of the truth. it's certainly not true if we believe that the story is over here. There is many actors, territorial actors. And territorial actors are also always legal actors, actors who are basing their claims and their action and their definition of land on socio-political structures which keep them together. Any state is a moderator. Any state is not an entity which totally controls all legal realities in a region, but a state is providing a framework within which the legal realities on the ground have to be pacified through instruments of process of definition of land. If land definition is imposed, it leads to war. Whoever imposes it, even if part of the ideas are good, the process which would be required is always a process of interaction between the different territorial realities and claims on the ground, which sometimes are against each other, sometimes overlapping with state concepts, sometimes totally contradicting state concepts. But if they are there, if there are social-political realities on the ground, and they are always there, ideas of land use to start with, ideas of land use by peasants to start with, which is simply the basis of their survival, then the state has always to accept the fact that there are legal contradictions. And the process has to make sure that these legal contradictions are led into a moderated framework where a common idea of land use can be accepted by all involved, which always includes even people up to the village level. So a state is not an entity which defines what territories are. That's in short the point. And here you have this map, a very interesting map, because it is an example of it's an artwork which tries to create an image of the state starting from the 1990s, as if the state has solved the main problems of previous generations. Partially, yes, because the creation of regional states, the so-called Kiloloch, had been a response to very explosive developments taking decades and decades of armed conflicts between central state actors and local regions. Especially the years from 1970s to 1990s were heavily marked by such conflicts, defined by local, usually ethnic-based liberation movements, who again took part of their energy from the local traditions, which were traditions of very simple defense of local land rights disrespected by state actors. But this is much older than the 1970s. It goes way far back into the 19th century, into the period when in Ethiopia stronger and stronger central powers were established and tried to insist on state power and on king's power, which included the creation of standing armies and more and more regularized taxation and so on. But the perspective, social science research and ethnohistorical research shows it. The perspective of local populations was very often towards the state was very often that of an invader and not of a legitimate moderator. If we look into rather central regions, we don't find this perspective very much. In the contrary, we usually find the idea that they were the pillars of state unity. In fact, they were the ones whose elites were usually participating in the raiding of other territories, while in more remote regions, you will not find this idea that in the past there was a harmonious unity in the country. There would be the idea that the state was an actor from outside, disrespecting local land rights, disrespecting local structures of leadership, and acting with soldiers, acting with force against legitimate structures. So in short, if we look at the stories from local actors, especially elders, and this is the main source of such research, who remember the stories of 2, 3, 4 generations before and longer, you very often come across this narrative that at some point, mainly, usually it's in the late 19th century to the 1930s, and sometimes well beyond that, those who represented the state were described as actors from outside. You find such stories in southwestern Ethiopia. You find them in Tigray. You find them in Afar. You find them in Somali territories. You find them in Gambela. You find them in Gumuz. In Gumuz, it is quite dramatic because there these actors of the state were exactly those people who only one generation before, and sometimes only a few years before, had been active in slave raiding. So the legitimacy of the state has not been strengthened during the long 20th century due to this rather unitarian approach of the state, and the idea that the unity of the state has to be protected by armies and by violence. This was in fact perceived by great parts of local populations, and this is what research suggests as an interference in local land rights. So certainly not a way of legitimizing state action and creating a united state. So the creation of regional states was a reaction to it, and certainly totally incomplete, because only some of the conflicts were finalized, were finished, were solved. Some were just put at hold. Others continued on a local level. But I have to also insist, continued, because the conflicts which we saw during the last years, the last decades, were usually conflicts which have a long local history. So we can only say that this was a first step to act towards the existence of socio-political structures on the ground, including territorial structures. So now what is important here, very often people claim that in the 1990s, a so-called ethnic federation had been created. This is not in the constitution. The regional states are, in almost all cases, with almost no exceptions, multi-ethnic. Very often they have a tendency of some homogeneity, but with sometimes very strong minorities, that sometimes they're even defined as multi-ethnic. So this is not an ethnic federalism, but I would call it an ethno-regional federalism, in which ethnic entities, regional entities, have been offered a specific new political framework to define themselves as regional states. Only in few cases, this was based on a quite strong sense of ethnic unity, which is mainly the case in the Somali regional state, while all other states have at least minorities, and sometimes are combinations of, let's say, of different groups of different levels, sometimes historically dominated by big groups, sometimes confederated among each other. And this is especially the case for southwestern Ethiopia. That's why I say we have a sort of regional, ethno-regional structure of a federation, which has been defined as a sort of response to the problems of construction of the state, an incomplete response. So this is the current map of Ethiopia. On the right, you have an outdated map, which I put there as a contrast, which is interesting in a number of aspects. But what is important here is two things. One, you see the highland populations. You have the so-called Amhara and the Tigray, which means Tigray. And you have the Somali in the east, so the lowlanders. And you see that the highlanders are shown in another color, rather greenish. and the lowlanders in the east in a yellow color. But what is really interesting here is not so much the impression of multi-ethnicity, which is the point here, the official point, but there is something unofficial, an unofficial point in this case. And I should not show you the map too long, because in a way it is shocking. If you look at the terminology on that map, it shows very much who were the map makers, or who were the main informants of the map makers. Those who are acquainted with Northeastern Africa, with Ethiopia, with the history of the region, already have discovered it. On the western side of this map, on the western side of in Western Ethiopia, you see, for example, the term Shankala. Shankala is not an ethnic term, even if this map presents it as a sort of objective reality, and that's the point. I will speak about objective realities on maps. It is a pejorative term, which is used for quite a number of Western lowland populations, a great number of different populations speaking different languages, even belonging to different language groups, such as Nilo-Saharan and Omotic further south, and Cushitic even. So the term Shankala, I almost don't dare to translate it. It corresponds somehow to terms which we know in English, such as nigger. You see, that's not a term you put on maps, but you see it here. In the highlands, you have a similar term, which is gala, which again is not a map, not a term which you find in any official map today, evidently not, because that's again a pejorative term for Cushitic-speaking populations south of the main center of power of the traditional Ethiopian state, which is mainly Oromo, but sometimes the term is also used to designate other Cushitic-speaking populations, such as the Sidama, and sometimes even others, such as the Afar, and still other Cushitic-speaking populations. This term had been coined by central Ethiopian elites, by the elites of the Christian Ethiopian state, who had been over centuries, again and again, in a conflictual relation with these Cushitic-speaking populations south of historical Ethiopia, and since the late 19th century, part of Ethiopia after a quite dramatic military expansion of the Ethiopian state. So this is not what you find normally on maps. But why do I show it to you? Exactly because of what I said before. Because maps have this tendency to present a sort of objectivizing set of data, creating the impression of an objective geographic reality, while they depend very much on the perspective of who is the informant, of who creates the map. So the term Shankala is a term which was exclusively used by highlanders who were part of the Ethiopian state elites, who had just few generations ago used that term in the framework of slave raiding and other traditions of raiding directed against these lowlanders, perceived as stateless, perceived as savage. You see this this perspective, which we know all too well also from European history. So within a setting of state power, it is sometimes typical for such states to develop divisions, which are divisions of terminology, which have a pejorative basis, and very often even a racist basis, in order, and that's the point, to justify and to eternalize to some degree a political action, political imbalances of power. The Highlanders are correctly called Amhara. There's nothing pejorative about it. It's a self-determination, while the other populations further down, outside these main state structures, have simplified denominations are put under denominations, totally ignoring the diversity of socio-political structures on the ground, which are simply not recognized. And that's the expression here. It's an expression of political imbalance. To illustrate that, I have just shown you shortly, I'm just showing you shortly in red the main core of the traditional Ethiopian state, the state of the highlands, in its maximum extension in history, and which is based on long-term territorial research, research in territorial data based on sources of the last centuries, including the Ethiopian chronicles, which are full of place names. So you can roughly reconstruct the main area of action of the Ethiopian state elites. And on the east, you have Muslim lowlanders mainly, which are organized most of the time in smaller sultanates and smaller other social political groups. I will come to that a bit later. And to the west, very different regions, very different. Nilo-Saharan populations, Cushitic populations, Omotic populations, who are organized in a very diverse manner in local states, kingdoms, local peasant republics, remote self-organized village areas, nomadic areas, and so on. You find the most amazing diversity in these territories. It is only in the late 19th century that they had become part of the Ethiopian territory. So you see what's developing now in my presentation is that we always have a sort of set which is created, a territorial set, which is created by the official boundaries of the Ethiopian state. And the more we look inside, the more we discover an incredible diversity on the ground. Here is another example. An ethno-linguistic map. It's a map produced by linguists on the different linguistic groups in the region, which again you see it reproduce some of the structures which I have shown you before in an historical context. Here you see ethnic ethno-linguistic realities, like the expansion of Ethno-Semitic languages in the highlands, which is marked in green here. This very roughly corresponds to the historical state of Ethiopia, while the other regions are marked by very different languages, which most of them have been included into the state of Ethiopia only in the late 19th century. But I'm speaking of the perspective of the state. The state, in its idea of, its quest of state building against all these local realities, which were very often perceived as problematic in the sense of destabilizing the state has searched for responses towards that reality. The more recent response is the creation of federalism, even if it's an imperfect one, but it was a response in the sense of recognition of local social political differences. In the decades before that federalism, there was a tendency which went into more or less the contrary, into the other direction. In public rallies, political rallies, you found military personnel with Ethiopian maps. You found demonstrations holding the Ethiopian map. And here you don't see these regional diversities, evidently not, but you see a sort of essentialized map of Ethiopia. And what is important here, I just come back to the map before. On the left, you have Ethiopia as it's today, without Eritrea. On the right, you have also the clear distinction between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Eritrea had become independent from Ethiopia only in the years 1991 de facto, 1993 legally, because it was a colonial territory, but not only because of that. but it had also a long history of local autonomous developments, which towards the Ethiopian state, which had developed quite violent ways of keeping its territories together, had developed a long history of armed resistance. And due to this long history of armed resistance, at the end, after about 30 years of conflict, the Eritrean state was recognized. But here in the decades before, here you have still Eritrea as part of Ethiopia. Eritrea had been annexed formally in early 1960s under in the framework of an abolishment of a United Nations sponsored federation or confederation, as you want to call it. So within this complexities of the region, you had the setting of a state acting within these complexities of the region, but trying to oppress or suppress these movements of independence in the case of Eritrea, and local resistance, which aimed at local autonomy and sometimes also independence of other territories. This was the time when there was a very strong movement in Tigray based on earlier insurgencies against an expanding imperial power in the 1940s. And in Oromo territories mainly, where an armed movement such as we find it also exactly today, was trying to redefine the territory in the sense that the state should not have the dominance over these territories. This was the dynamics which we found, and the response to these dynamics was the state using maps in a lot of different settings, and defining these maps, and that's what I want to suggest, in an iconic way. So in a way, the map became an icon. I have to remind you, I will come back to that a little bit later, that the Ethiopian state is highly marked by a strong visual tradition of the churches and of popular art, which was linked with the idea that the images are not simply, let's say, fancy like beautiful things for decoration of walls or great art to impress us. That was not the purpose of art in the Ethiopian church-based, Orthodox church-based tradition, but art was there to evoke the presence of something saintly, of something sacred, especially in the case of icons. That's why I'm using icon here. The presentation of Saint Mary, for example, I will come back to that after some minutes. The presentation of Saint Mary was based on the idea that through the representation of Saint Mary in a painting, Saint Mary was present. So icons are evoking the presence of the saint, or in other words, they are evoking something essential, something powerful, something which is beyond the grip of daily politics, daily conflicts. They are evoking a transcendent reality from beyond. And that's a bit what I see here in this beautiful picture on the military car. You have Ethiopia with a sort of eye and light. So Ethiopia, the state of Ethiopia is defined as a state creating light to its people. You see the people below, light to the people, hope of development. So you have an idea of the state being a supreme being, having a supreme existence. So we have here a real step towards a secularized iconographization or iconization of the Ethiopian map in the sense of the older sacred traditions. On the right, you have another image, which is a quite interesting example for a similar approach. In this case, you have Ethiopia, again, the same Ethiopia, and you have actors from outside, but also from inside, who try to destroy this, let me call it, eternal Ethiopia, which must be defended and which will win forever. You find this map of Ethiopia in that period everywhere. That's quite interesting because in only a few decades before, the map of Ethiopia was largely unknown to the local populations. The map of Ethiopia as an icon, as something dominating all discourses, is a totally modern 20th century invention in which the state found a sort of non-sacred, a sort of profane way of sacralization of the state by the permanent repetition of the shape of the state, which would impress the people in the sense that this would be perceived as an objective reality. Again, I come back to what I said before. This creation of the feeling of objectivity is exactly the effect of these maps. These maps are not perceived as representations of specific political concepts, which can change. They're not perceived as something with boundaries which had been created just in very recent times, because before maps were simply not known by local populations who had their own territorial traditions, who had their allegiances to specific political leaders, but not linked at all with this sacred idea of a territory in specific boundaries, personified by a map, but which were just personified by their leadership and by their identification with their land. And the identification with their land was always local. It was not national. This creation of a nation state through maps is what I'm describing here. And what is interesting now at this cover of a school book, this is a cover of a school book, is these different populations of Ethiopia standing around, which try to convene the message, this essentially unified Ethiopia, this map representing a unified state in one color, still provides the room for diversity. So these diverse people are carrying this essentialized permanent Ethiopia. So this was certainly one of the messages of the creation of such a map, which became a sort of icon of the state. But what to do later when Eritrea became independent? Do you drop this idea that you show maps everywhere, or do you simply create the discourse that Eritrea is out, but still Ethiopia is essentially one unified territory with this kind of boundaries, and that's it. That was decided. So we find the map of Ethiopia after the early 1990s on banknotes, on any publication. So the iconization of Ethiopia as a specific territory in these boundaries has been continued. You find it in Ethiopian Airlines, evidently, which is not surprising. You find it on government publications. And one example, which I believe is very important, is the atlas of the geographer Mesfin Woldemariam. Mesfin Woldemariam has created an atlas in which is based on this modern shape of Ethiopia. I remind you, an Ethiopia which had been created through a heavy expansion starting from the late 19th century only, including a lot of populations of totally different historical background and including linguistic background, ethnic background, and so on. So in this in this atlas of Mesfin Mariam, which was very popular in the 1960s and 70s. You find it in any library in Ethiopia. You find it in the departments, not only of geography, of history, and so on. This map was showing Ethiopia, even where it was treating historical developments of the past, always in the boundaries of today. There was no attempt to reconstruct the different regions which existed besides Ethiopia. There was no attempt to show the very chaotic and arbitrary change of international boundaries of Ethiopia going on over centuries in a most dramatic way. No, you had these boundaries of Ethiopia of today. In that time, I remind you, it is 1960s, 70s, including Eritrea, so that any modern educated person who would not be educated about the extreme contrast towards Ethiopia of only few decades before, only 100 years before, everyone educated within this system, within this setting of modern geography would have unconsciously this idea of an objective reality. This has started a little bit earlier, but was not yet very prominent here. A short example, which I believe is interesting. On the left, you find a map of the 1920s, which had been created by an Armenian map maker who was in the services of the regent of the state, Rastafari, the later Emperor Haile Selassie. What is now interesting about this map is it's a map showing Ethiopia in Ethiopian letters, but this is not, and that's what I would suggest here is interesting, this is not a map representing local Ethiopian realities, but it is a copy of European maps of the early 20th century. Therefore, it reproduces the discourses of international boundaries and not at all an Ethiopian perspective. This was just much later that this Ethiopian map became really identified, became an icon of Ethiopia, became a symbol of Ethiopia. This was a map which in the 1920s was used within the Ethiopian government, but was given away as a gift to a visitor from America. So you see the level of importance which was associated with this map, not very high. On the right, you have, it's just an extract, another map of Ethiopia. Here I have a focus on Eritrea, which shows again the official boundaries, a little bit more detailed with provincial boundaries. In that time, 1990s, Ethiopia was divided in provinces, not in regional states, and these provinces cut traditional historical territories into pieces. You see it here, for example, in the case of Tigray, in the southern part of this map, where large parts of the traditional Afar lands had been cut into pieces and divisioned between Eritrea, Tigray, and the Amhara regions south of it, Wallo in this case. So this is, however, still very popular among traditional Ethiopian groups, because these maps in that time started to be widespread in school material and so on. And these the people who were using these maps were not exposed to the realities on the ground. They were not present in these Afar territories, where the local people would use a totally different idea, different practice of territory, including the practice of rebellion against Highlanders domination. Now, we come to the recent years. You know that in the last 3 years, the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia has invited different political groups to join the political process. And according to region, you found very different maps, suddenly again carried by demonstrations. Here you have something extremely interesting. On the left, you have a saintly figure on Ethiopia. So here you have a real icon as I explained it to you, with angels right and left behind this map, protecting Ethiopia. So you have a saintly vision of Ethiopia, and you have certainly seen it. Eritrea is again part of it. This was the moment when there was the peace deal between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So this iconization of the map, which we saw developing over the 1960s, 70s, and then partially cut due to the independence of Eritrea, poof, is back. This original icon of an original Ethiopia perceived as saintly or sacred, and I would suggest eternal. This is a discourse which we find especially in Central Ethiopian Highlanders groups, who have, let me call it, adopted this idea of a map as an icon. And here you have a perfect representation of it. But still, in the same time, you have moderate use of maps. This is on the right. Around the same period, you have a festival, a religious festival, and you see Ethiopia without Eritrea in the political boundaries of Ethiopia, and an Ethiopian flag without the official star in the middle, which again is a sort of quotation of older images of an imperial Ethiopia, which didn't have the star. So you see, the map has become an extremely loaded image, a loaded icon, a loaded essentialized reality. Which I found interesting here. I'm showing it to you. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has then even been combined with such a map. You see, Eritrea is different, but very significantly, Eritrea is in his forehead. So this, I don't think that this is done by chance. Abiy Ahmed is here not only seen as a leader of Ethiopia, but as a unifier of the wide regions of the Horn of Africa. At his just left of his eye, on the right of his eye, you see Djibouti, you see the Red Sea, which is also part of his forehead. You see him here as a unifier, as a regional communicator, as someone creating a new form of unity and cooperation of the region. While you see that the independence of Eritrea is visible on this map, you find all unified in the person of Abiy Ahmed. So you have here a very interesting continuation of this essentialization of maps and of a sort of political sacralization of maps. On the right, again, just to remind you, the map of Ethiopia as it is today. And for comparison, an icon of Saint Mary. I believe this icon of Saint Mary is quite interesting, because if you look well, you find this is the map of Ethiopia. You see that the shape of her clothes corresponds quite well, really quite well, to the map of Ethiopia in its official 20th century boundaries, as we see it today. And the head is found if we put it on the map, the head is found quite exactly where Aksum is today, which is considered to be the sacred city of Ethiopians, and the city of Zion. And Zion in the Ethiopian tradition, so Zion is identified with Saint Mary. There is the most sacred church and the coronation church of the ancient Ethiopian kings, Mariam Zion, the church of Saint Mary and of Zion, which is in the narrative of sacred Ethiopia, identified with Ethiopia, with Saint Mary, with Zion. Zion itself is a territorial concept, and the fact that Ethiopia is here and Zion is now identified with Saint Mary and Zion and St. Mary have their sacred center in Aksum, which is the sacred city of the ancient kings of Ethiopia. You have an identification of an idea of a sacralized territory with St. Mary. Thus, again, you have here this idea, Ethiopia as an icon, Ethiopia as something godly, God-chosen, and to be identified with an eternal sacred reality. This icon is not one which I found by chance. There is a lot of variations. They all date of the 20th century, very often of the late 20th century, where you have this repetition, this reproduction of the shape of Ethiopia in the form of the clothes. Here you have other examples. On the left, you have an older example where you have a different kind of shape, not yet a sort of map-like territory. On the right, you have a more modern interpretation, which already follows that shape, which had been established quite recently in the 20th century, following the boundaries of, let me call it, sacralized Ethiopia. Now back to historical data on the ground. I'm finishing with that, with a number of examples. If we look into historical collections, what we find is absolutely striking. Absolutely striking in the sense of ethnology, ethnohistory, territorial history, in the sense of political history. Because in the 19th century, Ethiopia had opened itself towards international contact. In the early 19th century, the local autonomous and independent kingdoms and princedoms of the Ethiopian highlands had entertained international relations. The Kingdom of Shoa, for example, in the 1840s, entertained a diplomatic relationship already with Great Britain as an independent kingdom, signing a treaty of cooperation. The same was true a few years later with other Ethiopian territories, including after the 1850s of unified Ethiopia. Unified Ethiopia is what you see here. Unified Ethiopia is the unified Ethiopia after the unification of the 1850s, unification of the traditional autonomous or independent Ethiopian kingdoms of the highlands. Ethnically, this territory was mainly Tigray and Amhara, with an important Agao minority in different regions, and some Oromo minorities in some of the areas of the Kingdom of Gojam, which you see here in the left central part of the map. And in the southern part of the map, you see Shoa, the Kingdom of Shoa, with its own boundaries. You can see that Shoa is a little bit distinct from the rest because it had kept its autonomy well until the 1870s, and still played a role under their own kings. So these princedoms, which were unified within one Ethiopia, were not unified in the sense that local political structures were abolished, but local dukes, local military leaders, territorial leaders were recognized in their land rights and had only participated in the larger state structures of Ethiopia under the King of Kings. This was Atz Johannes in the 1880s, and later Atz Menelik starting from 1889. So if we look again at other examples, we see different versions, but again, you find this shape of Ethiopia, which mainly included the highlands with very few dependent lowland territories, especially to the west. I already told you some of these territories were settlement territories, but also slave raiding territories used by highlanders in a form of traditional expansion into territories without a strong political structure which could allow military defense. So these were rather areas marked by local groups with their own socio-political traditions, their own socio-political structures, but not strongly unified, so not forming entities which were able to defend themselves. So that was the traditional reality until the 1880s. And one important question is, why can we use these maps as historical sources? It's evident, and we always have to be clear about it. The maps are always showing a specific perspective, perspective based on key informants. And who were the key informants in the case of the Ethiopian state? It were the main state actors. It were the governors who were dependent on the King of Kings, all the local princes, who were all interacting with researchers coming from outside, who were map makers, who were producing these maps. So what we see here is a specific, again, state-based reality, but in a way it is closer to later claims, because the cartographers, the researchers visiting these areas were interacting strongly with governors anywhere where they arrived, and there was not yet the claim that a central state has the possibility to define the entire territory. The central state in the country did not exist. What existed was a King of Kings, who was a very strong, usually very strong moderator, a strong leader of armies in plural. Very often these armies were coming and joining the wars of the King of Kings based on alliances with local princes who had their own armies. So this is the historical Ethiopia, which was extremely federal in the sense of an autonomy of local definition of territory, local land rights, the distribution of power. Some of the regions were highly hierarchical, with land rights depending on the prince. Other regions were rather, we can call them virtually republics, with elders deciding on the distribution of land among the peasants, with any prince, without any prince or any king interfering. So the idea of a central state dependent, who is controlling the territories of the state, is a quite modern misunderstanding. That was not the reality on the ground. In the country, a leader who would go to a specific territory would ask where the boundaries are, because it is the local population who know their boundaries. It is not the leaders of the state who will know the boundaries. And the leaders of the state would rather be responsible for the big discourses and for moderation between competing forces, including forces competing with themselves. They would be responsible for putting armies together in the case of foreign threat, but foreign threat, again, was first perceived in local territories, who were then communicating with these stronger structures. So it's the country of a central state, evidently, even if the narratives of the king are very strongly influenced already in that time by this idea of Ethiopia being the land linked with the Ark of Covenant, and linked, which was in Aksum, in the church Aksum Zion, and linked with Saint Mary. But this was before the identification of a specific shape of the territory, sort of a specific map of a territory with Saint Mary, with this sacred narrative. So Ethiopia in that time was a conglomerate of the most diverse entities, and this is what makes it so interesting to look into these maps. What I have not mentioned, I have mentioned cartographers coming. I have mentioned international relations, which included diplomats sometimes coming into Ethiopia to interact with Ethiopian leaders, princes, and so. In diplomatic negotiations, sometimes they stayed for many, many months, linked with research on the ground, interacting with the local populations. But what I have not mentioned yet is settlers and researchers. Already starting, especially from the mid-19th century, we had researchers with funds, with budgets. European researchers with budgets, very often they were natural science researchers, in some cases already linguists, especially since the 1850s and 60s. First linguists arrived there, and very simply settlers. We can call them, if you want, people looking for opportunities, economic migrants, looking for chances as advisors of Ethiopian princes, as advisors of the King of Kings of Ethiopia, who established his rule already from the 1850s. So Ethiopia, as a quite huge state, as a huge entity, was extremely attractive for settlers looking for new chances. And a number of European settlers arrived there, intermarried with local families, who then supported them. This was also based on an increase of international trade, very often entertained by these local settlers. And these local settlers usually had quite a high level of education. In this case, on the right, you have a map, you have an extract of a map by an Orientalist. He had studied linguistics in Paris, Werner Munzinger, who then married locally in Keren, in today's Eritrea, learned Tigrinya and Tigray, and studied the local law of the Bogos, or this Bilin, as they are called today. And he was also a map maker. He got funds for map making because that was also a period when in Europe there was a boom of map making in the quest of understanding the world newly. This is part of a European history of Enlightenment from the 18th to 19th century, in which research was favored into all regions of the world, and that was a pre-colonial, partially colonial approach already, but in many aspects a pre-colonial one, because the interest was in that time usually not about domination, but about interaction and the definition of political and economical partners. So Ethiopia was perceived as an area open, as an ancient Christian territory, open for interaction with Europeans. That's why it was highly interesting for these settlers, for these researchers, to document local princedoms. So on the left, you have a map based on first reports by Werner Munzinger of around 1860 of the territories in today's Eritrea, between the already much larger Ethiopian state. Here you see its blue boundaries, and local princedoms, which were highly autonomous or even independent, partially organized under the leadership of elders' councils. You find all these territories in the sense of course, local imaginations, but also local practices. So some of these boundaries were quite exact because they were defined through rivers, through mountains, through escarpments. In some cases, they were based on negotiations. We have even reports from that time about negotiations between neighboring princes and ethnic groups who do peace negotiations and define a specific boundary in a specific area where the ones can graze their cattle and the others can use the land for peasants. So a clear legalized definition of local boundary making can already be found in these maps. So there's great detail. If we now go into these territories today, very often we find the same groups. The groups which we find on the maps of the 19th century, we find them today locally, speaking about the same negotiations of land rights with their neighbors, maybe with a neighboring group, saying this and this is the traditional boundary, which is still marking local practice. Sometimes it's a war boundary, because war clashes which had happened in the 19th century have defined a specific boundary, but still in some cases define conflict until today. And we have, even between these regional states, which I mentioned in the beginning, we do have armed conflicts based on unsolved territorial claims, which sometimes date back to that period. So you have overlapping legal concepts, overlapping social-political conflicts in some cases. In some cases, you have functional social-political structures. You have functional compromises. For example, this is one of the most fascinating things. You have local regional peace treaties, oral peace treaties, in which a specific territory is given to the neighboring ethnic group to put their settlers there, who then would interact as traders with the surrounding population, but having their own land rights in this territory. So this is a solution, a traditional solution of exclaves, of the creation of exclaves in order to assure the interaction between neighboring groups. You have quite a number of other solutions. I will not go further into that. On the right, just one more remark. You have Jeju. You see Jeju, which is a traditional territory. And what you find also on these 19th century maps is very often a sort of claim to be geographically correct. But what they are more than geographically correct, they are ethno-regional or regionally or politically correct. They reproduce specific narrations of territory. And these narrations are in this case, and that's what makes them so interesting, not narrations of a huge state dominating these territories, but of local princes, of regional realities. I will close now with some few examples which are interesting because this is really examples of local map making. The maps we have seen so far are maps based on European models. I think it had become clear that these maps are produced very much in interaction with local elders, princes, warlords, governors, so important political informants. So there is a very strong element of political self-definition of the representatives of specific regions, which are found in these 19th century maps. But the shape, the presentation is purely European. It has, again, this illusion of objectivity, of a reproduction, a sort of visual reproduction of the land itself. If I go back, you see it especially on the right. There's a claim of objectivity, even if, based on my explanations, it's, I think, very clear that this is a representation of narratives. Here you have real Ethiopian map making. My colleague Admasu Abebe, who has recently finalized his PhD thesis on the ancient kingdom of Dauro in southwestern Ethiopia, has found a very important map in the collections of the Perthes map collection in Gotha, belonging to the University of Erfurt. This is a quite important map, not because of its accuracy in the territorial sense, but because it shows the different sub-territories of Kullu, which is one of the names used in older times for the kingdom of Dauro, who constitute the kingdom of Dauro. Like the much bigger Ethiopia, which in that time was a neighbor in the north of this territory, much as the historical Ethiopia, also Dauro consisted of sub-regions, and these sub-regions were not sub in the sense of submitted, but they were sub in the sense of composition, of part of a composition of local representative structures, local clans with main settlements who would participate in the larger political structure of advisorship of the Dauro kings and Dauro kingdom. Again here, even in this very local level, no centralized structures. And what you see here, this has been produced by someone called Seminarium, probably a former slave. This was also a territory which was at the borders of slave raiding of the ancient Ethiopian kingdom. That's why sometimes you have slaves from that region who appear in the highlands. And this person called Seminarium had interacted with one French researcher and diplomat, Consul Guillaume Lejean, who made him sketch his kingdom. And what is also interesting, on the left, you have a plant, a traditional plant, which has a sacred role to play in the definition of the kingdom and its ecology. And to finish with the last map, another example which has been produced locally. This is much more recent. This is a map produced by on the Somali, Issa, and Afar border regions, where you have clashes between Afar groups and Somali groups. And this shows a local perspective of territories which are considered to be, in some cases, we can even say sacred, sacralized, in the sense that there are mountains which are identified with powerful spirits, powerful beings who are protecting the land and who should be protected. And other territories like rivers, water places, which are the basis for the population to survive. This is extremely arid territories with a high danger of for survival if the territorial order is not respected. And the territorial order is about finding grazing lands. It's about the use of waterways. It's about the use of valleys to find the next water hole and so on. It's all well defined. It's a case of a nomadic institutionalized use of territory, again, based on local boundaries, definition of who is using what in order to keep the society alive. So you have here also an example of social political interaction. Okay, I'm now coming to the end. To the last point, just to say goodbye at this point, we do have until today in Ethiopia these societies which sometimes are states in the shadow with their own leaders, with their own kings, who have even traditions of inthronization. On the left, an interview which I did with the old king of the Sultanate of Ausa. On the right, his successor, Amoita Hanfare Ali Merah, who also recently died and will be replaced by the next king of Ausa quite soon. All these do not appear on modern maps, but they are very crucial parts of the self-organization of local societies. And that's why I believe 19th century maps are such precious instruments to rediscover this local diversity, which is a social political reality until today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this great presentation. I know that we prolonged, but I did it on purpose since I'm in charge and I can do that. And I, as an Ethiopianist, I really wanted you to finish without being asked to do that on time. So yes, I will open the discussion, and first is Jasia Jurewicz.
Well, I think that first Daniel was, and Robert, I was the third one, so maybe I will.
Well, Daniel was just clapping because he had to laugh.
It was just clapping. All right. Okay. The icons are very difficult. I would really like to thank you, Robert. It was so fascinating from many points of view. And well, I have just a rather comment because your exposition was so clear that it is difficult. Well, I hope that I understood some of it at least. And so what I like very much is your approach to the concept of state and your, I would say, critic approach to the concept of state, that it is, I like it very much when you say, that maybe not in these exactly words, but you say something that many aspects of our thinking about state are just a fantasy. Yes, it's creation of our mind and attempt to make these categories of our mind to be real, but they are not objectively real, but they are not objectively real because they are just well, fantasies, as you say, and this shows power of our work of our mind, or even the brain. Yes, and I don't know if you know the book of the David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. It is a kind that is, well, it is maybe sometimes even a controversial book, but we could say that it is a new history of human social organization, and they claim that the state is not a necessary form of social organization, as it is, for example, presented even in schools in history, when we are taught that first there was hunter-gatherers tribes, and then there was something, and then finally the state appeared as a necessary result of our social evolution, I would say. I would like to just make one more comment about from the point of view of cognitive linguistics and our categories, how deeply they are embodied and yes, and but still they influence our external life, I would say external or social. That, for example, the very concept of state is based on a very basic idea of container. That there is, and the logic of container, this is very basic idea which really appears when we are very, very small children, before we even are able to talk or to have linguistic concepts, linguistic concepts. And the logic of this category, of this image schema, is that there is interior, exterior, and borders, and everything, I would say a lot of things and a lot of problems is connected with the concept of border, because the border can be of our container can be very tight, like, for example, everyone knows, in our Polish Belarusian border, or it can be more loose, like in the European Union, but it also can be negotiated. And I can see that this is what happens in Ethiopia, yes, that we can negotiate the shape, not only the shape of the border, but also how tight they are. Can we cross them or not? Yes. So this doesn't appear in the classic European way of thinking about state. In the classic European thinking about state, the border is the border, and it is impossible to negotiate it. Yes. And if you cross the border, usually you are either punished or you are an aggressor, like in the case of Russia and Ukraine. And this shows how but it isn't real. There is nothing like this. Yes, this is just our thinking about states in terms of the containers. And the last thing I wanted one more thing, and it is so strong concept that, for example, people who like Kurds, they fight for this independent state. They want to have their own container. Well, this is also very interesting that we cannot think about any other social organization which could allow us to live safely and happily without this model of container. And we don't have any more other models, I would say, for Europe for social organizations. So this is, I think, the huge problem of European thinking. How to and also people who think in this way, and there are many of people in the world who think now in this way about social organizations, that we don't have any other model. Well, maybe idea of link would be better. Well, I don't know. This I would like to investigate very, very much. So this is for example, one more thing. So we do not have because I have plenty of notes. We do not have a basic model for other concepts of social community, like the map made by Admasu Abebe. Yes, we just look, and here but where is the whole? What to do with that? Yes, we don't have category to understand this way of social communities. So thank you, really, thank you extremely much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just give a short comment on your comment. I believe that we have to understand fantasies make realities.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone agrees. Mm-hmm. So yes, states are realities, even if we should insist very strongly that they are fantasies. Mm-hmm. The problem of these fantasies is rising exponentially in the moment when these fantasies, which are called states, are essentialized against other entities. So what I want to say is states are actors among other actors.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This I would say is a very simple and evident truth of history if we just look after it, including territorial history and the history of populations. The state is one actor among many. These other actors can be villages, it can be elders' councils, it can be merchants, it can be trade routes. Yeah, they are not all territorial actors, but they are all actors who are interacting. And a state which essentializes itself and makes all these other concepts sort of submissed concepts, will always create clashes.
There is no place for them.
Yes,
within this way of thinking.
Exactly, because the state which creates this fake essentialist approach about itself removes local entities, perceives them as conflict brokers, while the only conflict broker here is the state itself, which essentializes itself.
Exactly.
This is something which fits perfectly to what you say, and I like your linguistic approach about containers. I believe this is very useful for thinking. Yeah.
Thank you, and I have many other ideas, cognitive ideas on maps of metaphors and blends, but this is we don't have time to that. But it was really extremely interesting. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second person to ask questions was Marcin Krawczyk.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, Volbert. Nice to see you. First off, maybe I will turn on the light. Sorry for the. Okay. A question. Yeah, two questions. The first one. I am now referring to the picture of the Mary / Ethiopia surrounded by angels, etc. Now, you didn't mention, I think, the context in which the photo was taken, but wouldn't you say that from the perspective of modern Ethiopia, where this secular approach to Ethiopian historical narrative is just so promoted, this image struck me as a bit of politically incorrect, this sort of identifying, Christian Ethiopia as a concept which is no longer en vogue. So I wonder what is your comment on that? And the question which I have, if it is too specialized, then of course we can move it to private exchange. I was wondering, if I remember correctly, reading the book of Federica Guazzini on delineating the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea, I think she mentions there how during Eritrean Ethiopian War, the one in 2000, both sides somehow suddenly became very much interested in those old maps from 19th century or early 20th century. And I am just very curious whether the same happened within the recent clashes, territorial clashes between Amhara and Tigray. But not the current, you know what I mean.
Yes, perfect.
The second question might be perhaps too specialized. It's maybe for the moderators to decide. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me.
First of all, sorry, the moderator decides to ask the question.
Yes.
Sorry, Robert.
I believe it's both useful. I mean, the first question is on this sacred Ethiopia, the sacred icon of the map of Ethiopia, linked with the icon of Saint Mary, and in some cases also with Saint George. I mean, yes, of course, it is incorrect. I mentioned it in a very indirect way because the photo which I've shown of the shape of Ethiopia with the saintly figure in the center, it was carried during the Trimgat celebration in 2019. So rather briefly after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed had started his reform process, inviting all actors of Ethiopia to come back, some of them from exile, some of them in inner exile, in internal exile within Ethiopia, and come back and participate in the political process. So as you are certainly aware, much of especially the central Ethiopian narratives, which is mainly Amhara, but not exclusively Amhara, but mainly Amhara based, these central Ethiopian narratives are very much still linked with the idea of a glorious ancient Christian past. So this is precisely the main actors of the past elites of the Ethiopian state. They were the main actors of also Ethiopian expansion, only if it's generations before, but these groups were the main actors. So this identification, this non-secular, sacralized identification of Ethiopia with Saint Mary is still absolutely dominant in the discourses, only because they were not correct in the political sense. They were not evoked publicly. But in diaspora discourses, in diaspora political groupings, and so it continued without any interruption. So in the moment in which the reform process started, and this invitation to the different political movements of Ethiopia was out to participate in the political process, you suddenly had this essentialist identification of the map of Ethiopia, which represents ancient Ethiopia, even if this is not historical, with the sacred sphere. Immediately you have this identification. This is important because this was something you could only observe in the central Ethiopian areas, not in the north, not in the east, not in the south. In the country, there was great shock, saying, who was invited by the prime minister? Was it the people who already had expanded with their armies into our territories in the past and submitted us, and now they go back to power? So this was very quickly a factor of inner conflict. This reuse of maps in the old new way, if you want. Okay. On the second, I make it shorter. Yes, the Eritrean-Ethiopian conflict in the 1998, beginning from 1998, was heavily marked by the use of maps, but at that time the focus was more on maps which could show document the specific historical layers of delimitation by colonial treaties, by international treaties defining specific border lines and so. So this was of high importance for the definition of which territory belongs to whom. Here, the problem, let's say, from an Ethiopian point of view, was that these maps were rather reproducing specific modern discourses based on modern treaties, which belong to the sphere of international law, which until today is evidently the framework which is decisive, and not so much local practices. So international law created a contradiction by the creation of boundaries based on treaties between state leaders in disregard for local realities. So the maps which were produced on the Ethiopian side were not very helpful because they were focusing on these local realities, which legally had no place. So this conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea expressed itself through maps, also through historical maps, but produced an open question, which has not got any sufficient answer until today. Even the conflict between Tigray and the central government and Tigray and the neighboring Amhara state, in very recent times was marked by the discovery of a number of historical maps, which were used to underline historical claims, which basically is a misunderstanding because historical claims are always modern political claims and never historical claims. Because history can only prove one thing, that the claims on territories were changing over time. That's the only thing history can prove. But what maps could show is that the big claims were changing repeatedly because of different power constellations of power. This could be proven, which is not what the one or the other side wants. Or they could prove the existence of local populations, which of course is important for the for the political process. But for this, you have to put together very many maps, which has been done recently in the case of Western Tigray. It's also available online, quite useful, but not useful in the sense of creating new claims, but in showing that using maps for modern political claims is useless. Using historical narratives to claim modern political change is useless because it removes the necessity of process and the necessity of respect for local populations. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess Kinga also wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
we can. Mhm.
Okay. Thank you, Robert, for very interesting presentation, and I love the map with Abby, with his face in the map. Just when I saw this picture, I just thought like that his face is turned to the side of Africa. He doesn't look to the Middle East, but towards Africa. So this was one of my thoughts. And another, I think it's maybe not the best association, but when I saw the map with the angel, what I saw was jebena, the kettle for making coffee, and I thought maybe it was not intentionally. I mean, I'm sure that it was not intentionally made, but but maybe it was prepared like that. That the shape of Ethiopia was somehow similar to the shape of jebena. But this was just my thought. But my question is, sorry, maybe you said something about this in the beginning, but I was late, so I mean few minutes, so maybe I haven't heard it. And my question is about marking the borders in Ethiopia in the like 19th century or earlier, maybe much earlier, before the first European maps were presented in Ethiopia. So, like, I think maybe my thoughts are I hope they are going in good direction, because generally in Ethiopia maps are not used even today. Like when we are in the cities, no one use the maps. People remember the space in the way like this is the building of something, or this is the shop which is called like this, or this place is called like this, and this is the way how in Ethiopia people remember the places, the like certain place, or yeah, generally, as I said, no one use the maps. So so my question is, how in the past people were marking the borders? Like, for example, in Europe, there were some kinds of stones which could be used as some signs of the borders, but I never heard about something like this in Ethiopia, and maybe you can say something about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe on the first point, shortly, I believe that if we look at the total lack of maps in daily Ethiopian culture, I think this is very useful. If we look at this lack of maps, we also understand why the shape of Ethiopia can be essentialized so much in the public discourse, because there's no experience with maps, and their also problematic side or their practical side, representing maybe just some pragmatic description of routes, or some pragmatic documentation of specific boundaries which may be changed, including internal boundaries which may be changed by a political process. So because of this strong link between the tradition of icons in Ethiopia, of let's call it the tradition of the sacred image of Ethiopia, and the appearance of the map of Ethiopia in this big visual political discourse, this link creates a sort of perfect eternal territory, but not something practical, something sort of beyond our world, transcendent. I think this is the main message, and this can be easily linked with also other objects which are used in this visual sphere to represent Ethiopia. So I don't want to exclude that your observation is right, that the jebena is also playing a role here, because this jebena, which is used for coffee, is one has become one of the non-sacred symbols of Ethiopia. So within the visual communication about Ethiopian identity, you have, for example, the shape of the map. In the more traditional setting, you have Saint Mary. In a more secular setting, you have the Jebena. So I believe that visually it's very logic if people put all these shapes together in order to communicate this idea of an essential Ethiopia, which is identified with its specific shape, even if, as we know simply from history, that this shape is a historical chance based on armies moving around and boundary treaties signed with neighboring colonial powers. So absolutely not essential. What was the second point? Remind me, one word.
Marking the borders.
Oh, yeah, very important. Yes, very important. Yes. This question can only be asked in a complete way through field research in all these different regions, from nomadic regions to peasants' highlands and so. So in this sense, cannot be answered. But of course, I did that in my research. And what I saw is, for example, stones as markers. As you say, this is a bit rare, but sometimes this is an ancient stone. For example, it may be in Tigray, it may be a stone which dates from the Aksumite period, which was a marker of a grave, of an elite grave. And then starting from this specific stone, the land of a specific peasant starts. So this is the very local reality. It can be a river. Even once, during one field research, I asked my local partners to explain me from where to where is a specific land to be used by cattle within the public grazing land. So what is known that a village uses public grazing land, this is something which we know from many European regions too. So public grazing land in our imagination is a sort of open land without boundaries. But even in this is not true. Even there you have sort of boundaries defined between parts of the grazing land. So one part of the grazing land will be rather used by people coming from this conglomeration of some small farms. The other part of the grazing land will be used by other neighbors. And here you have a line between trees, for example. Or you have a specific shape of the ground defined by a small river or a small water course. So especially natural elements are used to define boundaries. And if we look into the bigger context, the bigger question, like provincial boundaries or boundaries between princedoms, maybe you were already there. I think, yes. I remind you the moment when I showed you the map of Jeju, which was done by Werner Munzinger, or based on his research together with other cartographers. You had a sort of geography-based shape of Jeju, which seemed to suggest that Jeju is geographically, in a sense of natural geography, totally separated from the rest. There's one truth in it, that mountains and also trade routes along the mountains, like mountain passes, are used as boundaries between neighboring territories. And you have escarpments used as borders of territories. But the huge rivers like the Merab River between today's Eritrea and Tigray, or the Blue Nile between Gojam and the southern regions of Oromia below, this is a very ancient boundaries. But even if there are geographical realities, we should not fall into the trap believing that all this is about natural boundaries. It's about the social political exaggeration and use of specific natural boundaries, if this is suitable to a specific partition of land between neighboring spheres of power and spheres of social political self-organization. Then such things became a boundary. but there can also be a hill in the middle of a boundary of a territory, which will never be a boundary, simply because it is considered to be a center. So we should not exaggerate the idea that natural boundaries are the center for the definition of political boundaries. Even if they are to some degree, still they are political, still they are subject to projection. So this is also what I tried to show when I showed the map of Jeju. You have a sort of geographical illusion of a perfectly geographically defined territory, while from a natural science point of view, Jeju is much more complex than that and much less visible. So the map creates an illusion of a geographic reality of natural boundaries, while they are also politically defined. I hope this answer was not too complex, but from a local peasants level to the big political level of princedoms, this works very well.
Thank you so much, Robert. Yeah, of course, there is a boundary, like Takezi River, right? Between
Yes.
Right. Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, there's some room for a last question or comment. Anyone? If not, then me. I guess because I like this concept with the map of Ethiopia and Saint whoever, alas, Ethiopia as a chosen land, because it's beautifully comes with this idea of Ethiopians as a chosen people that is taken from Kibra Negest.
Yes.
So I can see some kind of cooperation there. Yeah, and I didn't, one question, because I didn't hear it properly. You showed the map, or this ethnographic map showing the Shankala. Who did publish that?
Yes, thank you. That was I mean, first on your remark on the link with the Kibra Negest, I didn't mention it just not to open a new chapter, but that's essential for the identification of Ethiopia as a political territory, and then projected on the map. Thank you, it's very important. Yeah, but this map with the Shankala, Galla, and so, that's a European map which you find in European information material even of the 1990s. Reproduced from older maps from the 1960s of European.
Okay, my eyebrows cannot go any higher at this point.
Yes. It's highly interesting. Yeah, Kinga has made a remark. The map was from 1970, but what is amazing, it was reproduced in more recent times. And here you have this typical European problem of these territories exist. We have the information, this objectivization of maps, and this absolutely naive approach that they represent a reality, while this map represents a specific abusive political narrative. So the Europeans themselves, they not only use and produce this kind of narratives, they also fall into the trap of these narratives all the time in reproducing maps of Ethiopia.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much for this really, really interesting presentation. I'm so happy that you're here, and to all of you that do not know that yet, Volbert will be here until 11th of December.
No, 13th.
Yes.
Even 13th. Great.
But on 13th, I'm going, so that's why.
Okay, so let's make it 12th. Let's make it 12th of December, and you'll be also participating as a keynote speaker on this week's conference, Art of Communication and Communication Through Art. So, and our panel, I guess, will be online as well. So let's see each other at the conference, and I hope that maybe later, when those two that are actually in Rome right now will come back to Poland, can join us. Karel Dobrochna, yes, I can see a yes there. Okay, so and yes, Saturday, good.
Initially, yeah.
Okay, so I hope to see you all one way or another. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and see you at the conference.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very
See
much.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
I have
you.
plenty of questions.
It was
but
brilliant.
you
Thank you,
have
Volbert.
time. Thank you.
Great, yeah.